The film was released in 1976, at a very specific point in American history. At the time, the US ended their involvement with the Vietnam War earlier in 1975, and after Watergate, people started losing trust in institutions and in the government in general. At the time of the film's release, the American film industry saw a decline in westerns, more specifically the traditional gunslinger archetype that was popularized in John Wayne films. Those films popularized and perpetuated the idea that problems can be easily solved if the right person has a gun. Not to mention, they also popularized a certain kind of masculinity, stoic, capable, morally certain, and respected. Usually they would have a man who's a lonely outsider wandering through a morally decaying society. He would usually carry a gun, believe he has a mission to cleanse the world around him, and sees himself as someone willing to do what others refuse to do. Travis Bickle, the main character, mirrors that same archetype in some way. He's a lonely outsider, wandering through a morally decaying city. He buys and carries a gun, believes he has a mission to clean up the city, and sees himself as someone willing to do what others, including politicians, refuse to do. However, that same archetype is viewed through a twisted lens. We see him as delusional, mentally unstable, and unpredictable, rather than stoic, capable, and morally clean. Usually whenever a hero had a gun, they were viewed as badass and capable, but whenever Travis handles a gun, it makes him terrifying, disturbing, and there's a layer of unpredictability because we don't know what he's going to do with it. After Watergate, people began to lose faith, confidence, and trust in institutions, and to an extent started questioning the traditional and simplistic gunslinger archetype. Travis is a dark reflection of the old gunslinger archetype through this lens. Hollywood started reflecting this change, and there were less stories about the good guys defeating the bad guys and saving the day, and there was a demand for films about protagonists who were darker, morally complicated, and less outwardly heroic. This is why Travis Bickle is so interesting to watch, because he has so many layers beyond the surface level. I don't know how you can talk about this film without mentioning Travis Bickle, played by Robert De Niro. What stands out the most about Travis, though, is his inner monologue at several points throughout the film. Whenever he's writing an entry in his journal, or whenever he's spectating and driving through the dirty, grimy, dark streets of New York, it feels like we're entering into Travis's worldview. Travis Bickle, like any other anti-hero, is at his most interesting when we follow his perspective. When we hear his inner thoughts, we as the audience feel less like we're watching someone in a film and more like we're walking in someone's shoes. His character arc is also very important to his character. When he gets the job of driving a taxi, that's when the bomb starts ticking. What I mean is that's when we, as the audience, hear about how he's disgusted with the whores, druggies, dopies, skunks, pussies, colorful language there, but it's meant to emphasize his disgust with his own country. He's a Vietnam War veteran, so when he returned to the country he served and saw the deplorable state it was in, he could be thinking, really? This is the country I tried to protect? It's never confirmed whether he truly believes this, but you also have to remember that when the film came out, the US ended their involvement with the Vietnam War a year earlier, and many veterans, when they came back to their home country, were not only in disgust with the state it was in, but were also left abandoned. So while it's never confirmed that he loses faith in his country in general, considering the context of when it came out, I'm willing to believe those thoughts crossed his mind a couple times. Anyway, as for the abandonment angle, it's never really confirmed that he was abandoned by his country, but considering his violent tendencies, I'm willing to bet the Vietnam War changed him. He doesn't really get help throughout the film, and there's no one who really wanted to address possible PTSD or any other psychological issues he could have faced. Although, it's also important to mention that Travis isn't completely pessimistic at the beginning. He encounters a politician in his taxi, Palantine, and his previous exposure to him was when he encountered his campaign. Although, he mentions several times that he doesn't follow politics very closely, but he has faith in the man to clean up the streets. When he's left disappointed by the politician's empty promises, he attempts to assassinate him. He doesn't go through with it, but he attempts to do so because he is tired of the lies and empty promises. His breaking point, though, was when he encountered a child prostitute, Iris, played by a young Jodie Foster, and this was when he decided to put his foot down and started taking action, which led to a shootout in a brothel, and was when the violent rage that had since been building up throughout the film starts to unleash in the most brutal way possible. There's another interesting layer to Travis that I need to mention, and that's the theaters that he visits. Anytime he's in the theaters, it's less about his own pleasure and more about intimacy. In all of these scenes where he's in the theaters, they're meant to show his growing lack of intimacy being displayed in reality, so he tries to project his own fantasies by watching them on the big screen. And even then, he doesn't seem to enjoy it that much. Anyway, as soon as Travis acquires a gun, that's when the film takes an interesting turn, to say the least. We, as the audience, have been slowly watching his mind unravel in real time and slowly becoming more mentally unstable. When he buys a gun though, there's an extra layer of tension as we're watching a disturbed, mentally unstable man handle a gun like it's a toy. The famous scene where he goes, "You talking to me?" is interesting because in a western it would play out like he's a badass, but in this setting and in this context, it's disturbing. We're essentially watching a man being deluded by his own fantasies of the action hero. He legitimately thinks he's no different than a Clint Eastwood or a John Wayne character. There's also an interesting bit of symbolism I want to mention. I honestly think that Travis almost represents some kind of animal who comes out in the wild and crawls around in the filth. Now, Travis doesn't actually crawl around in the filth, but he comes out into the wild with all the other creatures in his taxi, wandering around the city, aimlessly looking for a purpose wherever he can find it. Which really describes the structure of this film. The film has a structure where it's not really driven by A leads to B and eventually leads to Z. Really, imagine if all the letters were alone in plot, but followed in terms of a pathway to self-destruction. Travis gets a job as a taxi driver, he gets a girlfriend, does something stupid, gets broken up with, continues driving around aimlessly, gets a gun, starts exercising, encounters a child prostitute, forms a paternal bond, and that's what pushes him to his breaking point with the shootout at the brothel. While all of these events seem unrelated on a first watch, they are all very much related, not so much in terms of progressing a plot, but all of these events serve as build-up to Travis's eventual collapse. The reason why all of these events seem out of order is because they're meant to convey Travis's aimlessness in looking for a purpose. He moves from one subplot to the next with very little, if any, rhyme or reason. There's also a bit of dark comedy with his character. His socially awkward behavior and his lack of self-awareness is meant to show how his isolation has affected him. I also find it hilarious whenever he tries to insert himself in a conversation about a particular topic only for him to come out like, "Well, I don't follow blank that closely," whether it be politics, music, movies, restaurants. He mentions he doesn't know much about all of these things. My interpretation is that it's supposed to convey the barrier he has to not only the city around him, but also the culture and the attitudes of the outside world. It's just him, his apartment, and his taxi, and that's all he really knows. Now, at the end of the day, the film isn't interested in fully endorsing or fully condemning Travis Bickle as a character. The film wants you to understand him. That's why, at its core, the film isn't exactly a cautionary tale or a satire targeting one specific person. It's an exploration and a case study of a person who completely isolates themselves from the outside world and lives in their own metaphorical barrier. The performance by Robert De Niro is also worth mentioning. He's able to give this character a layer of humanity and depth that far extended from the script. The silence, the reactions, and the sheer charm he's able to give this character makes him all the more fascinating to watch, making him one of the greatest and most fascinating characters in film history. Martin Scorsese's direction adds a lot to the experience. There are these beautiful shots where we as the audience see what's going on in the outside world through the perspective of inside the taxi. It's supposed to emphasize the distance Travis feels towards what's happening around him. Another really nice shot comes from near the end of the first act. The context is that Travis has been going out with this woman, Betsy, who works at the campaign for Palantine, the politician he had faith in. Travis makes the horrendous and very relatable mistake of taking her to a corn theater. She storms out furiously, with Travis lacking any self-awareness of what he was bringing her into. Or maybe he had self-awareness and knew it was a prawn flick, but thought it would spark romance between them. Either scenario is hilarious to imagine. Anyway, the next scene is Travis calling Betsy to apologize, and this is what I wanted to bring up. Because as Travis is apologizing to Betsy, the camera pans away, and it's just a long shot of a hallway. What I love so much about this scene is that the film implies that Travis's reaction to the stupid thing he did was so hard to watch that even just listening to the conversation is difficult to process. What I also want to mention is that not only was the cinematography exceptional from that scene and from inside the taxi, but throughout the film it's amazing. There are these exceptional long takes that truly let you soak in the grit, dirt, and sweat that oozes from the environment. Another scene that I feel has exceptional camera work is the scene after the brothel shootout. There's an overhead shot with the camera very slowly and deliberately leaving the environment and showing the aftermath of Travis's breaking point, essentially. Not only showing the dead bodies and the blood and the gunshots all over the walls, but also showing how he's deemed a hero by the media for shooting disgusting creeps. Once again, the context is doing a lot of heavy lifting to not make the scene feel triumphant or satisfying, because in a western, it would be satisfying and triumphant. If anything, with the context provided, it's disturbing. It wasn't Travis doing something heroic for the sake of good, it was him finally finding people to relieve his frustrations over without having to feel bad. It's the breakdown of a mentally unstable individual who wanted to find a purpose and someone to blame, so he took his frustrations out on disgusting creeps no one has sympathy for. But the fact that no one has sympathy for them makes it all the more scary when the media praises him as a hero for taking his violent tendencies out on terrible people, because now his violent breaking point is seen as a heroic act because it's taken out on horrible people. Anyway, I'll discuss the ending in my theme section, so I'll come back to this later. Anyway, my interpretation of the camera leaving the room is Travis's soul leaving the room and looking at what was left behind after he went on a violent rampage. The score by Bernard Herrmann is also worth mentioning, and it's fantastic. I love how the sax theme is repeated at several points throughout the film. On the first watch, I found the score a little repetitive, and then on a second watch, I actually appreciated its integration in a lot of the scenes. Yes, it repeats itself sometimes, but I kind of like that about it. The repetition makes the film feel like we're stuck in a never-ending nightmare, and even then it separates itself in different renditions to where it's not annoying. I think the point was to make the film feel very dreamlike and surreal, and the variations of the sax solo makes it feel like we're hearing something familiar, but also noticing very subtle and deliberate changes which mirror Travis's arc. I also feel it's very important to mention that the sound design and practical blood effects for that brothel shootout is amazing. The gunshots feel explosive and sudden, and on top of that add realistic blood effects, and you feel like you're seeing a violent and explosive side to Travis that has been built up throughout the film. People have written countless interpretations on what the ending could mean, but I have two main interpretations, and when I say interpretations on the ending, I'm more specifically talking about the scenes after the camera pan. Either Travis died in the shootout and the scenes afterward is him in purgatory, or he survived the shootout and he found his purpose, which is driving a taxi through New York. I'll explain my first interpretation and then I'll discuss my second interpretation. Travis died in the shootout and the camera leaving the room was meant to be his soul leaving the room when he died and watching his fantasy come true. He found his purpose and he's remembered as a hero. When he talks to his buddies and seems like he's better at socializing, and when he's driving the taxi, no cynicism included, that's him finally finding what he's been looking for, a purpose and human connection. Whether he likes being a taxi driver doesn't really matter to him because he found his purpose, which just so happens to be driving people around in his taxi, which is kind of his purgatory because he's stuck doing this forever. Now, my second interpretation of him surviving the shootout is interesting. While he's able to form a human connection with his buddies and be remembered as a hero by the media, all of the admiration and respect and connection that he had doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, he realizes that his true purpose is driving around in his taxi and he's stuck doing this until he dies. Either interpretation is him finding the connection he was looking for throughout the film and finding his purpose, but he's stuck in the same position of being a taxi driver, whether he's alive or dead. Anyway, there's a lot of themes to unpack, so let's dive in. The film's themes relate to masculinity, isolation, connection, mental health, aimlessness, delusion, and so much more that I'm probably forgetting. The most important themes to address, however, relate to purpose and connection. Throughout the film, Travis aimlessly drives through New York, which has to do with his job, I know, but his aimlessness is reflected in the film's structure. He looks for a purpose, finds it, and then when things don't go his way, he abandons his purpose. A lot of the film is Travis finding something to stick to and realizing that it either doesn't give him meaning or it didn't go as he planned it in his head. All of that reflects his aimlessness, because throughout the film, he looks for a purpose and something to cling to. As for his problem with connection, it can really be attributed to the people he interacts with. There's a scene in an adult film theater where Travis tries to hit on a woman, but he's not able to do so because he doesn't have the charisma he envisioned he had. He thinks of himself as the typical badass action hero, but when he steps out into the world and interacts with someone, that's when reality kicks in. Whenever he interacts with people in general, he seems very awkward, detached, and lacks a lot of self-awareness. He doesn't really form a bond with a lot of the characters in the film. There's little to no chemistry between him and Betsy. He seems like the odd one out whenever he's with his colleagues, and he's not able to form a human connection with really any of the characters. The only person he's able to form a bond with was Iris, the child prostitute. The thing is, he sees how she's being treated by these creeps and what they are doing to her, and this was not only his breaking point, but also the moment he reaches his limits. Anyway, the film leaves a lot up to interpretation, like whether Travis should be viewed as a hero or a villain by the end of the film, whether he survived the shootout, whether the ending even happened, or even whether the film endorses or condemns vigilantism. At its core though, the film is a character study of a man who wanders around a city looking for a purpose, connection, or really any trace of humanity left in a decaying city. Not to mention, it also touches on very important questions relating to politics, like what happens when politicians who are elected to listen to the people and deal with these issues faced by regular individuals don't do as they are told and are left to the individuals to deal with these issues, which is why the film remains extremely relevant nowadays. The film honestly remains just as relevant nowadays than it did in the 70s. In terms of politics, in the last 10 years, people, men in particular, have felt like their needs aren't being met as much. They've felt like their concerns, and the concerns of the vast majority of people, aren't being heard. More specifically, the Democratic Party has primarily focused on issues relating to minority groups and people who have historically not have had as much of a voice in government. It's great that nowadays we're making huge steps towards being more open-minded as a society, but when are issues that affect not just those groups but a vast majority of people, when will those issues be addressed? People can't afford a house, inflation has drastically increased the price of groceries and gas, the price of healthcare has also been increasing by an absurd amount, when will crime be addressed, and many other issues that I'm probably forgetting. Not to mention, there's an increasing amount of men moving to the right, feeling like the Democrats are not addressing men's issues. I mean, there was, and probably still is, a male loneliness epidemic, masculinity crises are also growing, and men have increasingly felt undervalued by society. I'm not saying that Sneeko or any other right-wing grifter will solve these issues, they don't care about solving them either, but the right is speaking to men. I mean, I don't mean to beat a dead horse either, but that ad that felt like it was mocking what a man thinks the epitome of masculinity looks like, that didn't do the Democrats any favors. I have to mention right now that I'm not trying to make fun of Democrats or make fun of Republicans or vice versa, make the Democrats look good or make the Republicans look good. I just want to address this stuff because as a man, I'm also affected by stuff like this. Anyway, everything I just addressed was brilliantly portrayed in Taxi Driver. Travis is being increasingly undervalued as a person and is often treated as an outcast. The politician he had faith in to clean up the city, he didn't do anything, so Travis feels like he isn't being heard by the politician. And his pursuit for connection and his pursuit for a purpose, and as he's becoming increasingly disgusted by the world around him, all of that reflects everything I just mentioned in my relevance section, male loneliness and whatnot. And those are the reasons why Taxi Driver is one of the greatest films of all time.